Welcome back to News Channel 3. Right now, hunters are getting their blinds and guns around for the start of firearm deer season. It gets underway November 15th, but hunters are already out in full force with their bows. But how will this year's season shape up to be? Joining us this morning to tell us all about this hunting season is wildlife biologist Mark Mills. Good morning to you, Mark.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Now, I remember quite vividly that EHD was a big concern last hunting season. What's it look like this year?
This year we haven't had too many reports of EHD. We had one in Muskegon County where we think 25 to 50 deer were lost up there, but we've had very spotty occurrences this year.
So that's great news for hunters.
That is good news. That means we're not losing deer right before season.
Now, why do you think that is? What's the cause of the non-outburst, I guess, of EHD this season?
EHD in Michigan is really tied to weather conditions. Drought years where there's a lot of mud flats where the small bug that spreads EHD, that means that occurs on drought seasons. So last year was heavy drought across southern Lower Peninsula. This year, a lot of water.
I remembered seeing a lot of the dead deer around little bodies of water, and that's kind of how the bug then breeds in those areas and then infects the deer.
Yep, infects the deer, and then the deer develop a fever, and so they search that water out, and that's why we find it by water if they're trying to cool off.
Now, which counties were hit the hardest last season?
Last year, if you look at the southern Lower Peninsula, if you look at Montcalm, Ionia, Kent, and then on south, those were the hardest hit counties. And then all the counties around that had quite a few as well.
So are those the counties then that this deer hunting season maybe hunters should avoid because the deer population needs to regrow?
Well, not necessarily. There are spots where a lot of deer were lost, but for the most part, some of the counties should still have very huntable populations.
So are there any counties in particular that you know the deer herd is more abundant than others?
Well, in the places that the deer herd were most abundant are probably the places where EHD looked the worst.
Interesting.
Because they had the highest populations, and when you have a higher population, you tend to see more deer on a die-off like this.
What have you seen recently with the bow hunting season? Have you had any reports?
We're about average right now at the check stations as far as the number of deer coming in. The one thing that we've been noticing is that there's not as many guys out, or not as many hunters out in the field right now that we might expect.
That's interesting considering the weather's been great. You know, hasn't been as cold. It's been rainy, but you know, why do you think that is?
I think for some part it could be that the EHD from last year has hunters believing that the deer numbers are really depressed. And in some areas that might be true, but on the broad scale that's not. And it could be that they're avoiding going out just because they think the deer aren't there.
Hunting guidelines have changed this season because of last year's outbreak of EHD. Can you tell us what they are? Yeah,
well, EHD was a piece of that, but we feel we were approaching our goals in a lot of the counties in southern Lower Michigan. And so we split that big deer management unit into smaller pieces so that we could manage our deer populations in each county or each smaller deer management unit better.
So will less tags be available then in certain areas?
In some areas less. In some areas there will be quite a few still available because we have spots where we want to depress the population a little more, and we have spots where we want the population to recover some.
But overall, hunting season looks much better than last year.
I think so. I mean, the weather's been nice. It's not as dry out. It's been a little rainy, like you said, but I think we're ready to see some hunters out in the field.
It's still the beginning of the season. You never know what happens
It
next.
is. It is. We don't know.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, for sharing that with us.
Yep, thank you.